Story 1. I spent every summer of my childhood at my grandmother's house on Sycamore Lane. It wasn't in the city, but not fully in the country either. It sat at the very edge of a small, slow-moving town where the streets were cracked and weeds grew up through the sidewalks. Grandma's place was old, really old. White clapboard siding, a wraparound porch with paint that had peeled so long ago it looked intentional, and big bay windows that seemed like they were always watching the street. When I was younger, I loved the place. It smelled like cinnamon and cedar. There was always pie cooling in the kitchen window, a pitcher of sweet tea sweating on the counter, and a quilt draped over the couch that my great-grandmother had supposedly made by hand in the 1930s. The air was always a little cooler inside than it was outside. Even though Grandma didn't believe in air conditioning, the house breathed fine on its own, she'd say. That summer, the summer I turned 16, I stayed with her for 3 full weeks. It was the last summer I ever would. My parents dropped me off one sticky July afternoon, the car rumbling away down Sycamore Lane until I couldn't hear it anymore. Grandma waved from the porch, her gray hair pulled back in a bun, a floral dress fluttering in the barely there breeze. "You're taller," she said, hugging me. "You're shorter," I replied. That was our usual greeting, one we'd been trading since I was 12. Ours, she led me inside, and the familiar creak of the foyer floorboard welcomed me. The house smelled the same, like cinnamon, cedar, and something else I could never quite name, something faintly metallic. "Your room's all ready," she said. "Sheets are fresh. Don't forget to open the window at night or the air will get stale." That was another of her odd beliefs. The house needed air moving through it at all times. If it got stale, she said, things that don't belong would start to settle in. I never asked what she meant by that. Grandma's house was big for one person, 2 floors, an attic, a basement, and 5 bedrooms. The upstairs rooms hadn't been used in years except for mine. Dust sheets covered the furniture in the others, and Grandma always kept their doors closed. The one room she never talked about was at the far end of the hall, upstairs, the blue room, named for its faded wallpaper. I'd peeked inside once when I was little. It was empty except for an old wardrobe and a rocking chair. I remembered the chair because it had been facing the wrong way toward the corner instead of the room. I'd never seen it again. The blue room's door was always locked. That first night, after dinner, we played cards until almost midnight. Then I went upstairs, brushing my teeth in the tiny bathroom at the end of the hall. The open window let in the night chorus cicadas, crickets, the occasional distant bark of a dog. I was almost asleep when I heard the creaking. It was soft at first, like the floorboards settling. Then it came again, rhythmic, spaced exactly a few seconds apart, almost like footsteps. I told myself it was Grandma, but the sound wasn't coming from the stairs. It was coming from above me, from the attic. The next morning, I asked Grandma if she'd been in the attic. "No, dear," she said without looking up from her tea. "I don't go up there anymore. Too many wasps." I didn't press it, but that night I stayed up later, reading in bed. Around 1 a.m., I heard it again. Creak, pause, creak, pause, and then very faint the sound of something wooden tapping, like a chair leg hitting the floor. A few days later, I went with Grandma to the farmer's market. On the way back, she started talking about her parents and then her grandparents who'd lived in the same house. "It was busier back then," she said. "All the rooms were full, even the blue room." I perked up. "Who stayed in the blue room?" She hesitated. "Your great-great-aunt Margaret." "Poor girl. Never quite right after the fever. What happened to her?" Grandma's knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. "She passed before her time. Let's leave it at that." That second week, things got stranger. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, and the air would be freezing, even though it was July. My bedroom window would be wide open, farther than I'd opened it before bed. One night, I woke to the sound of someone whispering my name. It was so close I felt the breath on my ear. I spun over and turned on the lamp. My room was empty, the door still shut. The next morning I found small scratches on my windowsill, 4 parallel lines, as if something with claws had rested its hand there. It was 2 nights before I left when I woke to a soft creak outside my room. I got up, heart pounding, and cracked my door open. Assiso, the hallway was dark. Moonlight spilled from the far end, the end where the blue room was. Its door was open. I'd never seen it open. I should have gone back to bed. Instead, I padded down the hall. My bare feet were silent on the old wood. The blue room smelled wrong, stale, cold, with that faint metallic scent from the foyer. The rocking chair was there, turned toward the corner, and the wardrobe door was slightly ajar. Something moved inside it. I don't remember deciding to run. I just remember the sound. It made a slow, deliberate inhale, as if it had been holding its breath for years. The wardrobe door swung wider. I caught a glimpse of something pale, like skin that had never seen sunlight, and hair hanging in clumps over a face I couldn't see. The rocking chair creaked forward, though nothing sat in it. I bolted for my room, slammed the door, and shoved the desk against it. The rest of the night, something knocked gently, patiently on the other side. The next morning, I told Grandma I felt sick and called my parents. She didn't argue. She just nodded, her eyes unreadable. As I was leaving, she said quietly, "The house likes you. That's rare, but don't come back after dark." I never did. I've passed Sycamore Lane a few times since, and the house is still there, the porch sagging a little more each year. Sometimes in the very back of my mind, I think about going back just once to see if the blue room is still locked. But I know that if I step inside after the sun goes down, I might not step out again. Story 2. I spent the summer I turned 15 at my grandmother's house, the way I had almost every summer before. Her place was smaller than most of the big old homes in our town, but it had its own kind of gravity. Once you stepped inside, the air felt different, heavier somehow, like the house was holding its breath. It sat on the very edge of the marshlands in coastal South Carolina. On hot days, you could smell the brackish water if the wind was right. Grandma called it God's perfume and swore you got used to it if you stayed long enough. She'd been living there since she was a child, and her mother before her. 3 generations had passed through those doors, and according to her, no one ever really leaves. I thought she meant it in the sentimental way. I didn't know better yet. The place was 1 story, pale green siding that had faded in the sun, a deep front porch with a swing that creaked whenever you sat in it. Inside, the floors were uneven in places and the hallways narrow. The kitchen was always warm, like it had its own sun inside, and the air smelled of chicory coffee and bay leaves. But the strangest thing about the house was the crawl space. It wasn't like the ones I'd seen under other houses. It wasn't just a gap with dirt and pipes. This one had wood flooring underneath the house itself, and a little square door in the hallway floor that led down into it. Grandma kept it locked at all times. When I was small, she told me that's where she stored things for winter. As I got older, she changed her answer to, "Nothing you need to worry about." By that summer, I'd stopped asking. The first night I was there, I woke to the sound of scratching. It wasn't the soft skitter of mice, which we had plenty of back home. It was heavier, slower, like nails dragging across wood. It came from under my bed. I froze, pulling the thin quilt up to my chin. The sound went on for a while, stopped, and started again farther away, toward the corner of the room. I told myself it was just an animal under the house, and eventually exhaustion pulled me under. The next morning, I mentioned it to Grandma while she was frying eggs. She didn't look at me when she said, "Best to leave it be." Over the next few days, little things started happening. The rug in the hallway was shifted a few inches to the left one morning, enough that the square crawl space door was partly visible. A silver hairbrush appeared on my nightstand that I'd never seen before, old-fashioned, with dark bristles that smelled faintly of perfume and mildew. And sometimes in the heat of the afternoon, the house would go so silent you could hear your own heartbeat. Whenever I brought any of it up, Grandma would smile in that way she did when she didn't want to answer. Old houses, she'd say. They remember more than they forget. It was a weekend when the door to the crawl space was suddenly unlocked. I noticed it while passing the hallway one afternoon. The rug was pushed completely aside this time, and the brass lock hung open. I don't know why I knelt down to look. Curiosity has a way of overpowering common sense. I lifted the square door and peered down. The space beneath wasn't as dark as I'd expected. Thin lines of daylight filtered through gaps in the siding. The wood floor down there looked dusty, but there were clear marks, wide, scuffed trails that led away from the opening and disappeared into shadow. I started to go fetch a flashlight, but I heard Grandma call my name from the kitchen in a tone that made me shut the door immediately. That night, she stopped me on the way to bed. "You stay out of there," she said, her voice low and sharp. "It doesn't like to be disturbed." I asked her what it was, but she didn't answer. Just patted my arm and told me to sleep. The scratching returned the very next night, but now it was paired with something else. A muffled, wet sound, like someone chewing. It moved slowly under my bed, then paused, then shifted toward the door. One night, I swear I heard my name whispered from down there. Not in Grandma's voice, not in anyone's voice I knew. 2 days before I left, I woke to find the crawl space door wide open. The rug was shoved against the wall, and something was leaning halfway up through the opening. I only saw it for a second before it slid back down into the dark, but its hand was wrong, the fingers too long, the nails black and curved. When my parents came to get me, Grandma hugged me long and tight. She whispered, "You didn't answer it. Good girl." I didn't ask her what she meant. I didn't need to. That was the last summer I stayed at her house. She died 2 years later, and the place was sold to a couple from out of state. I've driven by since, and I noticed the crawl space door is still in the hallway. And sometimes when I think about it too long, I wonder if they've heard the scratching yet, and if they'll make the mistake of answering when it calls their name. Story 3. I hadn't been to Grandma Elise's house in almost 7 years when I went back for the summer after my freshman year of college. Life had gotten busy: school, friends, sports, and my parents stopped making the long trip to the small town in upstate New York where she lived. I'd always thought of that house as cozy when I was a kid. It sat on a hill just outside the main road, surrounded by pine trees so tall they swayed and groaned when the wind caught them right. The siding was pale yellow, the shutters hunter green, and there was always a pot of something simmering on the stove when you walked in. But when I pulled up that June evening, the place looked different. The shutters were hanging slightly crooked. The grass in the yard was high, waving in clumps, and the air around it felt still, unnaturally still, like the whole property was under glass. Grandma opened the door before I could knock. She looked the same, just a little smaller, her silver hair pulled into a bun, her eyes bright but tired. "You've grown into yourself," she said, pulling me into a hug. "And you've shrunk into yourself," I joked, and she gave a little laugh, but there was no warmth behind it. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and wood polish, but underneath that was something faint and sour, almost like milk left out too long. We ate dinner, catching up, and she told me which neighbors had moved away, which had died, and which should have, but hadn't. She still had her sharp sense of humor, but there were long pauses where she stared at nothing in particular, as if she was listening for something. That night, she showed me to the room where I'd be sleeping. It wasn't my old room. She said that one was full up, and I didn't ask what that meant. This room was down the hall, smaller, with lace curtains and an antique brass bed. The first thing I noticed was that the light in the room was off. Even with the overhead bulb on and the bedside lamp lit, the corners stayed dark. Not just dim dark, as if the light refused to touch them. I put my bag down and went to close the curtains, but the fabric felt damp, almost clammy. When I turned back to the bed, I realized something strange. There was no shadow beneath it. The lamp was on, the bed frame stood on spindly legs, but the floor beneath was perfectly, unnaturally lit. I didn't sleep well. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the faint sound of humming. A woman's voice, low and tuneless, drifting from somewhere in the house. It wasn't Grandma's voice. Hers had a rasp from years of coffee and cigarettes. This one was smooth, almost childlike. I lay there listening, but the sound didn't seem to come from a specific direction. It was as if the room itself was making it. After a while, it stopped, and I fell back asleep. The next morning, Grandma was already in the kitchen making coffee. "You sleep all right?" she asked. "Yeah," I lied. Later, while she tended to her garden, I wandered the house. My old room's door was shut, a heavy piece of furniture pushed in front of it. When I tried the handle, it didn't budge. The rest of the place was just as I remembered, except for one detail. Every mirror was covered with fabric. Scarves, towels, pillowcases, anything that could be draped. Even the bathroom mirror was hidden behind an old sheet. When I asked why, she said, "Too easy for something to come through if you're not careful." She didn't elaborate. That night, the humming came back, but this time it was closer. I opened my eyes and saw movement in the far corner, the one the light never reached. Something was standing there. It was shaped like a person, but wrong, somehow too tall, head bent at an unnatural angle to fit under the ceiling. Its skin looked gray in the dim light, and where its eyes should have been, there was only smooth skin. It didn't move toward me. It just stood there until I blinked, and then it was gone. The next morning, I confronted Grandma. She stirred sugar into her coffee and finally said, "There's a room in this house that don't belong to the house. Been here longer than the walls around it. My mama told me it was here when she was a girl, and her mama told her the same. Things come and go from it. You just don't invite them." I asked if she meant my room. She looked at me for a long time. "That room ain't mine to give," she said finally. "You just keep your eyes on the floor and your feet in your bed at night, and it'll let you be." On my last night, the humming didn't wait until I was asleep. It started as soon as I turned off the light. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, until I felt the mattress dip just slightly, as if someone had put weight on the foot of the bed. I looked down. Nothing there. But when I glanced towards the shadowless space beneath the bed, I saw something staring back at me. Its face was inches from the floorboards, upside down, its two long fingers curling around the bed frame. The skin was pale, the mouth stretched in a grin that looked carved. I didn't move, didn't breathe. After what felt like hours, it slowly slid backward into the floor, not under the bed, but into the boards themselves, like water soaking into wood. The room went silent. The corners stayed dark. I left the next morning without breakfast. Grandma hugged me, but her hands lingered on my arms, her grip just a little too tight. "You didn't follow it," she said softly. "That's good." I've never been back to her house, but sometimes in the quiet just before sleep, I hear humming again, and I make sure to keep my eyes closed.